Good morning, everyone. Wasn't that the best? I love that. We lost a few sheep in between services, but those three held it down. I'm like so impressed. I, you know, it's not accidental that we time this pageant with our theme of joy, that during Advent we have a kind of progression of themes, starting with hope, moving to peace, celebrating today joy, and culminating with love. But joy, something about joy is so necessarily experiential. And I think we could all say that we experienced joy as we watched that. I have just a few like little favorite moments in there. And I think like this raggedy bunch of shepherds, like just hearing little sweet little Olive, and like just the brilliant inflection. I loved Preston just demanding taxes up here. And I was saying in first service, like, well, that just felt true. Like, I think we saw a little glimpse into the future there, our little Caesar. But something about it is just delightful, and I know for Toby, she's holding so many dynamics together in this and gets a little bit worried. And I always try to tell her, like, it just can't go wrong. Right? Like, even when it goes wrong, it goes right. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed that. With Advent, this is a time of us centering our minds on the thing that holds it all together. We've been studying through the book of Acts, and it's about the birth of the church. But what we have in the beginning of Acts is some beautiful messages given. Peter gives us one. Right now, we're in Stephen's message as he is telling before the church leaders this message of why Jesus was the inevitable culminating point in the entire story. And there's a quote that I've read last week by C.S. Lewis where he talks about Jesus being this miracle that ties together all other miracles. He calls it the grand miracle. And he's going to say that the story of Jesus is like the missing pages of the symphony. And he would go, you can recognize this. If somebody were to come in and say, no, this is what we've been looking for all along, how would you know? He would say, not only would it provide something brilliantly new, but it would help us understand all the things that came before. It would tie all of it together. And this is what I love about Stephen's message, is he's essentially doing this. They're going, why do you say that Jesus is who you claim him to be? And he's going to say, well, let's go all the way back to the beginning of the story. He's going to explain it through the very origin of this story in Abraham. This story that begins with Abraham leaving home. Abraham on this journey. And the kind of consistent theme through all of this is this facet of who God is that ultimately becomes the name, one of the names of Jesus. That Jesus is referred to as Emmanuel. And that name literally means God with us. And this idea that not only did God come uniquely in this child with us, but that God has been all along with us on the journey, starting with Abraham, and as we're going to see this week, in the life of Joseph. Now, our Joseph today was brilliant, but not that Joseph, not Joseph from Nazareth. This is Joseph who went to Egypt, Joseph with the coat of many colors. And we're going to look at that, and we're going to see this unique way that God is with us, not just away from home on this journey, but even in the midst of our suffering, even in the times of trial, even in times of betrayal and accusation and misunderstanding, God's presence is with us. Now, this morning, as we sit here, I think that we have a unique way of understanding and seeing joy. And this is important. Just like last week, we talked about how peace is something different than how we typically understand it. We see peace as the absence of conflict. That you can have peace when like all the boxes are checked, when all the problems are solved, when you've finished your last final or whatever that thing is. Finally peace. But the truth is, this is not the peace that we see in Scripture. That sort of peace we know is always sort of elusive. It's fragile. But the peace we see in Scripture is something different. It is the peace that comes with the presence of God. That God with us is the thing that grounds us and anchors us. not just in times of pleasantness, not just in green pastures. It's the kind of peace we can experience in the valleys, the peace we experience in the shadows. And what we're going to find that today, too, so is joy. That joy can find us even in those places. And this sort of robust joy isn't just an alleviation of something or the fulfilling of some pleasure. It's the thing that strengthens us and allows us to persevere. How many of you today, is there anybody here that's like, I think I actually have enough joy? Anybody? No? Anybody here that could use a little bit more joy? All of us, right? And part of this is the way that joy works. It's not that you're doing something wrong per se. It's just this fullness of joy is often something that we experience and then it's gone. When we try to manufacture it, we don't end up doing a very good job. It becomes like a thin veneer. And so we settle for things like pleasure as opposed to true joy. But joy, we know it when we experience it. It comes out of nowhere. It surprises us at times, sometimes unlooked for. That sort of joy is the thing that reminds us that we're not home, that we too are on our journey. The fulfillment of that is always ultimately ahead of us. And yet in these moments, we get these little gifts of joy that spur us on. But when we understand joy and its source, we can live our lives in such a way that we are open and receptive and available for it. Jesus said he came into this world that we might have life and life abundantly. And to me, this third painting is, to me, the one of joy, my very favorite of all. And it gives us this image of just this spilling over, that God is pouring out joy, and we are sort of this limited vessel that can only contain so much. And if we're honest, we're a somewhat leaky vessel. If we were to all of a sudden lose that source of joy, that it would dissipate pretty quickly. That living a life of abundance requires living in a right relationship with God. That becomes ultimately the source of that joy. And that joy is found in this gaze, this loving gaze of God. One of my favorite things to do in the pageant, as these kids are up here just being their brilliant selves, is to just turn around and glance backward for a minute at parents. There, to me, I think if you want to understand joy, that's where we see it. It's in this look of adoration of a parent looking at their child. And how many of those parents are judging their child's performance? Hopefully none of you. I don't think any of you. Right? You just are looking to see them be themselves. And when you see those little hearts on display, you don't care if the pitch is right. You don't care if they're wandering off, right? These little moments that just delight our hearts. And I think this is one of the gifts to me of joy. I've said this before, and I don't know who I'm quoting who said this, but they said that God lets us be parents so that we understand what it's like to be God. That to understand that gaze, ultimately in the end, is the thing that anchors us. We're going to see that in our story, I feel like, so clearly today. And that is the depiction of joy. That God is not just with us, but that God adores us. God looks at each one of you with such delight, even when you're off key, even when you forget your lines. That look of God towards you is the source of that joy. That is the water that is spilling over. And for us to understand that, to receive that, to recognize that, is what allows us to then step into our calling. The blessing of God poured out on us becomes the blessing that we are now able to give the world. It must be received, it must be experienced, and then it must be given away. God's presence brings true joy. And I mentioned that our story today that's being told and where we find ourselves in this story is coming through Stephen. He's a deacon of the church, but he's somebody that has this flowing through him. We're told he's filled with God's Spirit. In fact, when he starts preaching, it radiates out of him like light. This is a heart of transparency, a heart that has received and understood this love. And as he tells this story, he goes back to Abraham and talks about Abraham leaving home, that we had to leave home in order to find it. That our true longings are only ultimately going to be in the life to come, and that all of us are on this journey towards a promised land. And today he's going to come in his story to Joseph, and I'm glad he did, because Joseph is my favorite. And to me, I think Joseph is a case study in wisdom. How do we become who God has called us to be? And if you know Joseph's story, it starts with a vision that Joseph has this moment, and it's not a great moment. He has this moment where he has this dream, and his siblings are all bowing to him. And he kind of lacks the emotional intelligence here and goes like, hey guys, I had this dream. And you're like, Joseph, shh, right? All you guys were bowing down, and they're like, we hate you now. And Joseph was also the favorite child, so he had his dad's favor, so he had the special coat, all of this. This results in a moment of hatred towards him from his brother. They sell him off into slavery, and this is how the story begins. In Acts 7, verses 9 through 11, this is what we'll focus on today from Acts. It says, because the patriarchs, these are his brothers, were jealous of Joseph, they sold him as a slave into Egypt. But God was with him and rescued him from all his troubles. He gave Joseph wisdom and enabled him to gain the goodwill of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So Pharaoh made him ruler over Egypt and all his palace. Then a famine struck all Egypt and Canaan, bringing great suffering, and our ancestors could not find food. When Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent our forefathers on their first visit. On their second visit, Joseph told his brothers who he was. And Pharaoh learned about Joseph's family. After this, Joseph sent for his father Jacob and his whole family, 75 in all. So this moment in our story, God with us. Now, they would have known this story. And if you're not familiar, I'll give a kind of a little bit of a rundown, because this idea of God with us, we see in some very unique ways in this story. And the story is a heartbreaking story of betrayal. That is really how it begins. That Joseph is sold into slavery, and these brothers, they wanted to kill him. It's only one of his other brothers that all of a sudden goes like, wait, maybe we shouldn't go that far. They sell him to slave traders who take him to Egypt, and there in Potiphar's household, instead of Joseph becoming overwhelmed with his victimhood and his sorrow, he just can't help himself. That we find that Joseph is a very gifted leader. He's got a good organizational mind. He sees things that are kind of out of whack and goes, let's fix this. And so sure enough, there Joseph starts problem solving for Potiphar. There in that place, Joseph, in kind of his freedom to just be him, ends up receiving this blessing from God. In Genesis 39, 2 through 6, it says this, the Lord was with Joseph, so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household, of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. It's this beautiful picture of even here, even far from home, even as it turns out, having lost his freedom, and in this place of slavery, he ends up living out this blessing of God in this very place. God's favor is there. God is with Joseph. And so what happens is this favor is received and then given. And I love this, that Potiphar's like, oh, this is working out great. That wherever Joseph goes, he just becomes this conduit of blessing. It follows him. God's not limited in his ability to be with Joseph or to prosper Joseph. even in this place that is so remote and far from home. And I kind of look at this and go like, gosh, I wish this was sort of the capstone of this story for Joseph. Because then we could probably come up with a formula here of how to control this blessing. All you have to do is stay in this place of obedience, and you're going to thrive. You're going to prosper. Everything's going to go your way. And sometimes that is, I think, a little bit what we think of like with God's favor, that blessing is somehow ours to make us prosper, that we can ensure a sort of peace underneath our control. But that's not the case as we see here. That Joseph happens to be, we're told, a pretty good-looking guy. And Potiphar's wife is going to end up making a move on Joseph. And Joseph flees from that situation, resists the temptation, but it's not enough to keep him clear that in that rejection, Potiphar's wife goes to Potiphar, accuses Joseph of indiscretions. And Potiphar is going to take Joseph and send him unfairly to prison. Now, we're told later in the story that Potiphar knows he's innocent. He knows Joseph's character. He probably also knows his wife in this situation too. But to save face, he's got to get rid of this guy, and so he does. He sends Joseph to prison. And there too, we just see Joseph being Joseph. As Stephen's going to tell us, we see God making Joseph wise. That vision that Joseph had as a child is being formed, but also there's things in Joseph that are being changed. There's a humility that's being formed in him, a freedom in his heart not to be attached to his success or his talents. God is doing this deeper work. And this path of wisdom, I think, is helpful for us to think about because I think we're all on it. There's this line, if you're, not that this is some profound movie, but did anybody see Evan Almighty? I kind of think that Morgan Freeman is a brilliant God, but Morgan Freeman says this. He says, if somebody prays for patience, do you think God gives them patience? Or does he give them opportunity to be patient? If they pray for courage, does God give courage or opportunities to be courageous? If someone prays for the family to be closer, do you think God zaps them with warm, fuzzy feelings? Or does he give them opportunities to love each other? And I think in some ways this gives us a window into what God is up to. That here in prison, here without attention, here forgotten, Joseph just continues to lean in to who he is and experience this blessing even there forgotten in prison. Joseph has this ability beyond just his talents as a leader. He's able to interpret dreams. And a couple of the people in prison have dreams. One of them is like good news. That's a good dream. The other, it's a bad dream. The one with the good dream is the cupbearer of Pharaoh. And Joseph tells him, you're going to be freed in this situation. And when you get there and you're standing before Pharaoh, remember me. Don't forget about me. I've been left here and I shouldn't be here. And the cupbearer's like, you bet. He's freed and immediately forgets. So there Joseph is sitting in prison, forgotten, left to himself there. And in chapter 39 of Genesis, the story goes on and says that Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. Once again, Joseph can't stop being Joseph. In there, this ability to lean in to who he was made to be. And that God's favor is there. Here we see it again. But there's one more thing added in the text, and I think it's significant. He didn't just show him favor, it says he showed him kindness. And that word kindness, this is probably, honestly, a terrible translation. That word in the Hebrew is this word hesed. And that word often gets translated, I think especially in the Psalms, as like the steadfast love. That in that place was God's provision In that place was God's favor, but in that place was God's steadfast love. And interpreters would say, even that doesn't capture the gist of it. There's a woman, Sally Lloyd-Jones, wrote a children's Bible, and she in there gave a definition of hesed, and she says, God's hesed is a never stopping, never giving up, unbreaking, always and forever love. Never stopping, never giving up, unbreaking, always and forever love. Jesus can do whatever he wants today, by the way. It's his day. This never stopping, never giving up, unbreaking, always and forever love. And this idea that where Joseph is in this place alone, forgotten, everything stripped away, in the valley of the shadow, God is with him. And I think of this like that gaze of a parent of his child. And I think as parents, we know what it's like to delight and adore. We also know what it's like to suffer with our kids when they're hurting. That God comes into that space and he's with Joseph. And what that feels like, maybe you've never felt before. I think that we don't get to create that or curate that. We just simply receive it when it comes. But I can think of a couple times in my life where when I felt most alone, that God was there. And it comes in like a warmth. It comes in with this texture of grace. It reminds us that we're not alone. God comes into that space and says, I see you right there in the midst of the forgottenness, in the midst of the pain. That look of affection, that look of adoration. Henry Nouwen captures this, I think, so beautifully. He says this, you are the beloved. You are God's beloved. It is on that identity that you have to build your life. Later he says, being the beloved expresses the core truth of our existence. Once you've come to know that truth, you can live from it. That belovedness is not anchored in performance. It's not anchored in our ability to hold all these things together. It's not based on any sort of recognition or significance that we gain from outside sources. It's simply that. It's something that we receive from a God who looks at us and knows us and delights in that. Joseph is going to be finally remembered. That Pharaoh himself is going to have dreams, and the cupbearer is going to be like, oh, shoot, Joseph. 13 years later, Joseph is brought in front of the Pharaoh. And the Pharaoh is going to tell him his dreams, and Joseph goes like, oh yeah, this is bad news. Like there's a famine coming. This is what this means. So this is a heads up. You have some time to react. And again, Joseph being Joseph goes, you're going to need to organize this stuff because you have this opportunity to store some things so that you're ready for it. So find somebody who knows what they're doing and put them in charge. And then I love this. He kind of turns to go back to his cell. And that could look like indifference, but I think really what it is detachment. He's no longer trying to control this situation or build his own case. And of course, Pharaoh looks at him and goes, oh, you're my guy. Elevates Joseph all the way to the top. Number 2, puts the ring on his finger, gives him that power. Our passage today tells us that Joseph is now able to save his family. But what's wild, is this moment of reuniting with his brothers that tried to kill him, right? And you think about this story and what you would be tempted to do, right? This is like delicious for revenge. These guys come in and stand before him and you're like, oh, get him, Joseph. Karma, right? Like exact vengeance. And instead what you see is Joseph moved with emotion. He excuses himself and breaks down in tears. You can imagine the trauma, everything that's going on in him. But responds with such beautiful grace And he's like, no, I get it, right? Like their motives are so impure. And he's like, we all know you guys meant that for evil. But God meant this for good. This sense of like total trust that God, even in the midst of terrible circumstance, can turn this around and do something profound to rescue his family from this. And Joseph becomes the source of that rescuing. And this pouring out of grace, this is what comes from being in the presence of God. That we receive this love, we receive this identity, we understand who we are, that it puts to rest any insecurity or need to be something else other than who God made us to be. We're told that the gospel is for freedom, that it's for freedom that you've been set free. A heart free from that self-obsession or insecurity, from that critical look towards others, from that need to take vengeance. And what we find in this story that we're reading in Acts, if we can kind of take one more like step backwards, is that it's being given as testimony from somebody who is accused. Stephen is speaking on behalf of Jesus to the religious leaders who are pushing back, trying to silence this message that ultimately in the end, this message is going to cost Stephen his life. And Stephen is in there and he's speaking truth, but without this need to be right. Just with this ability to kind of hold this out and go, here it is. This is who Christ is. This is the opportunity here. And what happens in this place of resistance is that Stephen has a vision. That Stephen standing there all of a sudden is like looking up into heaven and he sees Jesus standing at the right hand of God. It says, when the members of the Sanhedrin heard this, they were furious and gnashed their teeth at him. But Stephen, full of the Holy Spirit, looked up to heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. Look, he said, I see heaven open and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. And again, we're reminded, all of this is pointing us there. I wonder what that look must have been like from Jesus. I think he was beaming with pride, looking with such affection at Stephen, going, that's my guy. I loved all his life. That's my little boy, right? This affection for God and going like, ultimately in the end, all things, all joy, all peace, all these things are set right. Ultimately in the end, beyond the veil, that there's Jesus not seated, but standing. You get this sense that he just doesn't want to miss this. Stephen, in this place where Stephen speaks these words, forgive them, they know not what they do. Like, where did he hear that? Well, just a few weeks earlier than this, at the crucifixion of Jesus, maybe a few months earlier. That Jesus hung there on the cross, and in this place of accusation, in this place of suffering, in this place of misunderstanding, all kinds of falsity poured out upon him, wrongfully accused, Jesus responds with grace. This is this profound love of God, poured out on everyone, on those who receive it and those that don't, lavishing us with it. And here's Stephen, in the end, able to receive that love of God and then give it to his accusers. And see, this is love that we can't comprehend. This is the kind of love that changes the world. This isn't love in return for love. This is love that stands on behalf of one's accusers and makes a defense for them. Forgive them. That Jesus looks at those accusing and responds with adoration and love. But that this is what we too are called to do. In a world that is filled with so much contempt, acts of violence, one we just got up and read about this morning, and you're going, what is going on in this world? A place with such division, such hostility. We are the light of the world. That we receive that light and then we bear it. That doesn't mean we hide truth. We speak truth, but truth with love. That we don't get caught up in that contempt, which is like cancer. But instead, we allow ourselves to be seen and disarmed by that love of God. To let go of those insecure attempts at trying to control everything. To let go of our need to exact justice or judgment on our terms. And to respond with warmth. To respond with joy. We become the ministers of the blessing. When we receive that, we are therefore equipped to give something away that is not ours to muster up, but instead what must be experienced first and then given. That we love because he first loved us. This story of Joseph is this brilliant story of how God shapes us through this. And that is the story that each one of us are walking. Each one of us experiencing levels of this to some extent. But giving the opportunity to grow, to become wise. But not just wise, but to become gentle, to become light to the world. When this joy breaks into our lives, we receive it. We welcome it in and we let it change us. But we follow it back to its source. Lewis is going to say that these are like beams of light from God. He calls them momentary coruscations. And he says our mind must run back up the sunbeam to the sun. In Hebrews 12, it says that we fix our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross. That joy was you. Scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. This is the joy that we're given. It's not this flimsy joy, not this sentimentality, not this like thin veneer of happiness. It's robust. It is weighty. It has this weight of glory. This joy set before Jesus was you, and the joy set before you is him. That in that gaze, that we are transformed, so that when we look back on the world, we look with that gaze of love. As always, I've got some questions for reflection as we draw to a close. But number one, where in your life are you most tempted to seek approval rather than trust that you are already seen? I'm out of time. To seek approval rather than trust that you are already seen. How can we bring our life back into that gaze? Number two, how might joy look different if it were rooted in God's gaze rather than in being understood or vindicated? This was challenged for me this week. Misunderstanding, subtle accusation. How badly I want to respond back and defend, to prove that I was right. What if it were enough for me to simply sit in God's gaze, to understand his approval? And number three, what freedom or grace might become possible if you loosened your grip on the need to defend yourself? How much this robs us of joy, creates in us worry, anxiety. What freedom might become possible if you loosened your grip on the need to defend yourself and be right? Would you stand with me? Tonight we're going to meet back here at 5 o'clock. If you would like to be here, we'll take communion together. It's always such a beautiful time to prepare our hearts as we get closer to Christmas and the celebration to come. We will experience more of that joy together as we get to be the family of God around the table. We have a meal following this. You're all invited to, so please stick around, help yourself. But I pray today as you go that God would bless you and keep you. That he would make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. That he would lift up his countenance on you and give you peace. Amen.